Europe is falling behind, as we've seen in several previous videos. It's not just that the southern countries are struggling, but even giants like France and Germany are heading down the same path. Until now, there was a group that denied this was happening. According to them, Europe had simply chosen a different social model from other countries that are doing better, like the United States. Of course, those defending this idea that things aren't going so badly were mostly politicians and bureaucrats. But the situation is so serious that even they have realized that the continent's course must change. A few days ago, the former president of the European Central Bank delivered a report highlighting all of Europe's economic problems. But, and this is the most important part, it also comes packed with solutions. The Draghi Report outlines a new model for Europe, one that aims to once again put it on equal footing with the United States. Many of you might think that the European Commission and other bodies constantly release reports, but let me tell you, this one is completely different. So, the questions are clear. What does Draghi propose to revitalize the European economy? Will this serve as the new roadmap for Europe? And perhaps the most important question, can it really work? Hello to all the community of Finance for All, welcome to another video. The Draghi Report starts by clearly identifying Europe's main problem, the lack of productivity. Yes, Europeans work less than Americans. We may see this as either good or bad, but at least that loss of wealth comes with something in return. The issue with productivity, though, is different, and it's precisely this lack of productivity that explains 70% of the gap in GDP per capita. And we're not talking about a small gap. To put it in perspective, Hawaii, the poorest state in the US, has the same GDP per capita, adjusted for purchasing power parity, as Germany, and nearly 50% more than Spain. The main culprit for this gap is the lack of investment. But hold on, we're not talking about a lack of public investment. In fact, European states invest the same percentage of GDP in R&D as the US. The real problem lies in private investment, which is much lower. To give you an idea, even communist China has a larger role for the private sector in investment than Europe, both in terms of GDP and relative to total investment. Essentially, European companies don't invest. And since they don't invest, they don't grow. To make matters worse, for the past 20 years, almost all the top investors in Europe have been in the automotive sector. Yet, the big players leading the electric car transition are Tesla and BYD, which are American and Chinese companies, respectively. Who's to blame for all these failures? Mainly, it's that venture capital is almost non-existent in Europe. In other words, there are very few investor groups willing to put their money into small companies to help them grow. These groups are essential because, unlike banks, they specialize in selecting high-growth companies, which allows them to take on greater but more profitable risks than banks. The problem is that in Europe, there are so many financial regulations, and taxes are so high, that venture capital invests 80% less than in the US. As a result, European savings sit collecting dust in fixed-term accounts at their local banks instead of financing businesses. To put it in numbers, in the US, bank assets are roughly 100% of GDP, historically just over 50%. In Europe, it's 400%. All the money is locked up in local banks. Add to this that almost none of the world's top universities are in Europe, and that nearly all the best researchers end up working in the US for 10 times the salary, and it's clear why there's so little innovation. For Draghi, the solution is clear: investment, investment, and more investment. A boom in R&D spending to 5% of GDP, 800 billion euros in just 5 years. To put it in perspective, the Marshall Plan increased investment by just 2% at most, less than half that. How will this be achieved? Draghi plans to cut and simplify many regulations, lower taxes on venture capital, and drastically increase spending on education. There are two key points here. The first is that adults must continue their education through various programs. In other words, the days of finishing your degree in your early 20s and never opening a book again are over. The second key is to create programs to encourage talent retention in Europe, based on excellence. Draghi wants engineers to stay in Europe. Now, the former ECB president knows perfectly well that this won't be enough to reach the 5% goal, so he calls on states to invest public money like never before. How will it be financed? We'll discuss that later. For now, you can hold on to the fact that the most repeated recommendation throughout the report, by far, is to centralize the competencies of member states into a single central body for all of Europe. Why? The idea is to copy the US, where almost all public spending on science is decided at the federal level, not by individual states. According to the report, this would lead to much more efficient spending, less influenced by local lobbies, and would also concentrate subsidies in the fields most critical for Europe. The plan is to eliminate national regulations and impose a single European regulation, which in theory, would be less oppressive than the current status quo. Because yes, when we talk about European bureaucracy, it's not just about the European Union, individual countries have their own bureaucracies too. In any case, a word of caution, don't think that Europe will suddenly adopt the US labor market model. Draghi makes it clear, the European social model is non-negotiable. But putting that aside, there are two other major problems Europe faces, and both are closely related: the energy transition and the trade war with the US and China. Earlier, we discussed how regulations and taxes are holding back investment in Europe. But there's another big reason: the extremely high cost of energy. Europe has always had much higher electricity prices than the US, but after the war in Ukraine, costs skyrocketed. Today, prices have recovered somewhat, but they're still high, and there's always the fear of another major spike. Perhaps the only positive was that Europe invested in renewables early, but they did so too soon, turning them into a bottomless pit of public money. However, contrary to what it might seem, for Draghi, this is not bad policy but rather an opportunity. In fact, while he admits that green policies are one of the three biggest challenges for Europe, due to having much higher targets than the US or China, his solution isn't to backtrack, but rather the opposite: Europe needs to accelerate the energy transition. Basically, the idea is to turn this problem into an opportunity. Europe could take advantage of the fact that CO2 is practically a luxury good here, using it to boost investment in renewables that are cheaper than gas and coal. To do this, there's a clear call to explore all possible alternatives, including nuclear power. Draghi advocates exploring nuclear energy further, for example, through new modular reactors. Of course, he also proposes creating new European bodies to direct subsidies toward clean technologies, bypassing the filter of individual member states. But wait a minute, didn't Draghi say we need to deregulate? Well, not entirely. In the case of energy, it's actually the opposite. In the section dedicated to energy in the report, Draghi essentially blames the system's dysfunction on a secret monopoly of companies speculating on energy prices. As for taxes, Draghi talks about lowering them, but it doesn't seem that the CO2 tax is one of them, even though it reached €110 per ton in Europe, while in California it was €30 and in China only €5. And speaking of China, there lies Europe's other major concern: geopolitics. Europeans have experienced firsthand what it means to depend on a dictatorship for something as crucial as energy. But our dependence on other countries, like China, for key materials is even greater. That's why Draghi is clear: mining must return to Europe. Still, having cheap energy in rare earth materials won't do much good if there's no industry capable of turning them into competitive products. What's the solution? To start, the report acknowledges that there are sectors in which Europe is so far behind that it's not even worth trying to catch up, unless they are strategic. However, there are other sectors where Europe is lagging but still has time to catch up with the right push. An example, once again, automobiles. How could that push be delivered? The answer probably won't surprise you: with a European-style Inflation Reduction Act. In other words, more subsidies for European cars and more tariffs on Chinese and American vehicles. The report makes its position clear: Europe has fallen behind in the automotive sector due to a lack of planning, and the solution is an industrial New Deal. The idea is that this would only be a temporary policy, and within a few years, the industry would have modernized enough to compete head-to-head without subsidies. But, of course, that remains to be seen. The question is, who's footing the bill? That's what we'd all like to know. On one hand, Draghi plans to ramp up public spending to unprecedented levels. On the other hand, he makes it quite clear that the deficit cannot be allowed to soar. So, public spending will have to be cut, right? Well, remember what we said about Europe enhancing innovation with a singular focus on excellence? It comes with two significant caveats. The first is that excellence must be inclusive, meaning it should benefit everyone and not exacerbate existing inequalities. However, in the last paragraph of that section, they acknowledge that the idea of highly talented individuals earning hefty salaries is very American and doesn't align with the European social model. Thus, income tax for middle and lower classes would need to be reduced. Or in other words, raise taxes on the wealthy even more. Yes, those who move to the US for higher salaries and are precisely the ones you want to retain. Will the plan work? That remains to be seen, but while the press has hailed it as Europe's Great Awakening, it seems like the same old recipes, lots of talk and little resolution. To start, it appears that Draghi wants Europe to be like the US, but without actually being the US. In other words, he wants a competitive private sector, but instead of having a very flexible labor market, he wants to achieve it through subsidies. Moreover, this is a completely different path from the one the US took to become wealthy and also differs from the route being followed by the most successful countries in Europe, like Poland. And what's the worst part? The report still doesn't take a stance on very important debates. For example, let's return to the previous case. Do you want more students in engineering fields? Yes, but don't even think about eliminating subsidies for majors like journalism to reallocate resources. Want cheap energy? Yes, but don't touch the main tax, which is the CO2 tax. It's the same with everything. Mario Draghi invents an ideal world that doesn't exist and never will. Just a few days after this report was presented, there was a European vote to strengthen the single market. What was the result? Rejected due to opposition from France, Italy, and Spain. Why? Because centralizing funds would take them away from member states. In summary, the Draghi Report is very good at assessing Europe's problems, but it's unclear whether the solutions proposed are the best ones. And certainly, it doesn't seem that other European politicians are very willing to support them in any case. But now it's your turn. What do you think of the report? Do you believe it offers good solutions to European problems? Will it become a roadmap, or will it end up gathering dust in a drawer, forgotten by all politicians? Feel free to leave your answers in the comments. If you liked this video, give it a like, and we'll see you in the next one.